Right, good morning everyone. A warm welcome to all of you for surviving a second day. And it's a great pleasure to be back here for a second year. This time I have the pleasure of moderating a very distinguished panel of ambassadors who spend most of their time trying to do what this forum is also aimed at doing, which is to create dialogue, engage, and create bridges between Europe and Iran. So we're very thankful for them to take time out of their very busy schedules to join us all here today. Helga Schmidt, I think, quite clearly set out where Europe-Iran relations have come to in the last 4 years. It is incomparable, I think, where we are today to where we were 4 years ago, even when Yar was trying to set up these conferences. But I think there is a lot that we need to unpack, and I'm going to put some of the ambassadors on the hot seats today to try and help us work our way through these difficult questions. I would request someone to put the time on for us so that it's not blinking at 0, so I have some idea of where we stand. But we're going to have about half the session devoted to discussions between us, and then we'll come to you in the audience, as I'm sure you have a lot of questions you're wanting to ask our ambassadors. Some of the questions that I've been really discussing on the sidelines of the last day with you all has really been the elephant in the room that we haven't quite addressed. And I think I understand the reasons for it, but it is the issue of what's happening in Washington. We have a whole panel dedicated to that, so after this, and I don't want to spend too much of this discussion looking at this 15th of October decertification deadline. I'm sure we'll address some of these practical issues and what they mean for businesses, but I also want to take the conversation beyond not only just the nuclear deal, but also beyond where Europe-Iran relations are headed in the medium term, and how all of you in the room can help towards the building blocks to take us there. So I'm first going to come to Ambassador Annan. You have been doing some very interesting work with Danish companies in the last few years. We had your colleagues you on yesterday talking about some of the interesting export credit facilities that have been created by Danish companies, banking sector, governments. Take us through some of the areas of progress you've been seeing, particularly in the last year, when companies have been in quite an uncertain position regarding what's happening in Washington. But there has been progress. So give us your view on that.
Yeah, definitely. There has been impressive growth in bilateral trade between Denmark, but also other European countries. If you look at the growth rate from 15 to 16, EU member states had an increase of 27% in exports to Iran. Denmark managed 55%, but if you look the other way, it's actually even more impressive, of course from a lower starting point, but Iranian exports to the EU increased 375% from 15 to 16. And as we just heard from Helga Schmidt, the first 6 months of 2017 compared to the same period, 16, 94%. So the growth is definitely continuing to increase. And that is, of course, one of the major benefits of the nuclear agreement. There are also many other benefits, but in this forum, the increase in trade is, of course, of absolutely pivotal interest. If you look at from a Danish perspective, then what is it that's actually happening? It is primarily pharmaceuticals and medical device. Even before the lifting of sanctions, we did quite well in Danish exports within those areas. But also ingredients for food industry, shipping has increased, machinery, different kinds, also for food production. But it is actually broad-based, and you can see that if you look at of the share of pharmaceutical products in the total volume of Danish export, it has increased, but overall it has actually decreased because so many other sectors have entered the market. And I'm an optimist. I do believe that we are still only at the beginning of the increase in bilateral trade. We heard yesterday from the representative of the Danish Export Credit Agency that a deal has been signed in Vienna, not only with the Export Credit Agency, but also with the leading Danish bank, Danske Bank. And that is, of course, going to open up for much more trade, because as we all know, for most companies, the challenge is banking relations and financing. And with the two agreements we now have from the Danish Export Credit Agency and Danske Bank, that has, to a certain extent, eased for Danish companies, but also actually in a more broad sense. So I do believe that we are only at the beginning of trade. We need to bring up the trade to the volume where it's supposed to be. From a Danish perspective, our trade to Turkey is 3 times higher than it is to Iran, and to Saudi Arabia it's more than double up. And I don't see why we should not be able to bring it up to a higher level. Of course, there are challenges. Some of us discussed it yesterday. The World Bank has an index of ease of doing business in, and the ranking of Iran in that index is to put it mildly, not impressive. Iran is number 120 out of, I think, 180 countries. So also a lot needs to be done inside of Iran. It's not only a question of the JCPOA, it's also a question of doing some structural reforms in Iran to promote trade even more.
Danny, let me follow up with a question. Helge Schmidt outlined that there has been a lot of interaction between European governments and the banking sector, but that European governments can't tell banking boards what to do. What are some of the creative solutions that the government, such as your government, has been helping facilitate and push on? And is the model that we heard of yesterday with the Danish Export Credit Agency a model that other European countries could follow?
I think actually a lot of other European countries are already following it. Other European export credit agencies are also in negotiations or have already extended credit lines to Iran. The major challenge is that it is primarily small and medium-sized European banks that have engaged the Iranian corresponding banks. We do still need the major European banks to engage to be able to finance the major projects. And we all know that there are major projects in Iran that needs financing. Just to mention one example, the oil and gas sector, according to the Ministry of Petroleum, there's a need over the next 10 years of $200 billion of investments. So that, of course, requires foreign funding, because Iran does not have that kind of funds. There are also many other concerns in the Iranian society and business community. So there is a need for foreign direct investment, and that also requires some of the major European banks to engage.
Thank you. Ambassador Hopton, I'm going to pose a wider question to you after this, but since we're on this banking issue, London is the banking hub of Europe. Some of the most major banks have their headquarters there, and yet we've heard a lot of disgruntled Iranian colleagues here talking about the deadlock, particularly in London, about this banking issue. What are some of the ways that your government is thinking about addressing these problems going forward, that we can show there's been progress on this front?
Thank you, Ellie. Well, as Helge Schmidt, Secretary General, said, there's a limit to what governments can do to persuade private sector entities, particularly banks, to engage in any piece of business. They take their decisions for their own commercial and other reasons. However, the British government is very committed to making a success of the JCPOA, and part of that has to be the increase of trade and deals and the availability of finance for that. And so it has been a slow period, slower than some might have expected. It takes time to build the confidence necessary, particularly in financial institutions and places like the City of London, for banks to engage. Now, my government, the British government, has been active consistently since the signing of the deal in trying to build that confidence, in explaining and engaging with banks that this is a constructive step to take, and that the opportunities in Iran are huge for trade and for the benefits of the JCPOA to flow in both directions. And in some cases, progress is being made. The overall direction of travel is positive. And others, Danny and the Secretary General, have explained the European-wide picture of positive increase in trade figures, just for the UK alone. And of course, remember, the UK, we closed our embassy for 4 years, and we've been absent from the market, perhaps more than others, for a longer period. But in quarter on quarter, the first quarter of this year compared to last year, UK trade increased by 78% with Iran, our exports to Iran. And that's a very positive step. It's starting from a relatively low base, but all this goes to show that the engagement of the British government with the private sector, with financial institutions, is gradually making progress, and that as confidence increases in the JCPOA and its future, I'm sure we'll see the picture improve even more.
Ambassador, since you mentioned the JCPOA's future, let me put you in the hotspot here as one of the negotiating parties. Your government worked very hard in terms of pushing the deal, and also has worked very hard in coordinations with the other E3 members in the last year to try and keep Washington on board, to see what constructive progress can be made beyond the deal. Can you outline for us, when Helga Schmidt and other Europeans have said that the EU and the countries who signed the deal will stick to the deal, unpack for us what that means, absent the United States?
Well, obviously, I'm only able to really speak for the United Kingdom, but the British government is very clear about the benefits of the deal and the risks involved in decertifying if that were to happen. We are fully committed to the long-term implementation, successful implementation of the JCPOA by all the partners involved, and that's what the British government is working very hard to achieve. As the Secretary General said, I think there's a big responsibility on all partners, and that includes Iran, of course. And at this point, we judge, on the basis of the IAEA reports, that Iran is in full compliance with the JCPOA, and we would expect that to continue for a successful future for the JCPOA. And I think that is going to be the key benchmark for the United Kingdom in reaching our judgment whether Iran continues to respect its obligations as well under the deal. So we hope that President Trump will recertify the deal, and the United States will continue to play a constructive and important role in the implementation of the JCPOA, and the United Kingdom will do everything to work with all our partners to achieve a successful implementation.
Thank you. Ambassador Delay, let me come to you here. Since we're talking about another potential period of uncertainty, we've had a year since the last forum of, again, clear unpredictability from Washington. How are you advising companies that come to you in Tehran to devise their plans? Is it keep calm and carry on? Or is there more assurance that we can offer from the government perspective to the private sector in this climate?
Well, first of all, let me say that as a Belgian ambassador, it's always easy to speak after Secretary General of the European Union, because usually we start by saying, okay, we completely agree on what has been said. And sometimes we believe it, sometimes we believe it a little bit less, but we say it anyway because we are Belgium. In this case, having heard what Helga Schmidt said, I mean, I can say we are 100% behind every word that she has pronounced. The tone, everything was perfect. So if anybody here is interested in the national position of Belgium with regard to this question, I mean, I can refer it from start to the end to the speech of Helga Schmidt. As far as companies are concerned, this is not really the way it works, because what we see is companies take their decisions by themselves. They do not come to us asking, what do you think? What should we do? Of course, they are trying to assess the situation. They come to us for information about Iran, information about regional situation, and they take their business decisions based on this information we provide to them, but also on all the rest of information that they gather from the market. And that's why it's so important for them to have also opportunities like this one, like this forum, I mean, to confront their different approaches to the market. our advice would be just to wait and see. There is nothing else we can do. We can reassure them completely on the fact that the EU and Belgium will be 100% trying to make this deal work and want it to stay. So we are trying to do our best from our side. Not always well enough, I must say. There is more that we could do. And for instance, there are a number of bilateral treaties that we would like to be signed. I must say the Iranians are quicker than we are. Sometimes our process is slow, too slow. So this is one of our role as ambassador, trying to push this while the time is ripe for this. But otherwise, I mean, short term, I do not see too much of a problem. Everybody who's coming and approaching the Iranian market with a longer term perspective are very careful. And whatever we will say, they will just now wait for a few weeks, see what happens. As has been said, I mean, financing is very much of an obstacle. Much more could happen, I mean, if transfer were more easily available, and especially financing. So I think it's a general picture that we have. Just final word, if I can say, this situation here, really for a country the size of Belgium, I mean, it really shows the importance of the EU. This is not a crisis that countries the size of Belgium will be able to solve or just to navigate, not on their own. I mean, it has to be done collectively. And this is why we always hope that we keep this same very firm and united EU position that we now have.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Terstol, let me come to you in terms of trying to understand a little bit more what Helga Schmidt underlined, and I know that the European governments are very much working on this, looking at beyond the nuclear deal, in the medium and longer term, where are relations between Europe and Iran headed? We spoke earlier about how the JCPOA is a model for how cooperation rather than confrontation can achieve positive results. What is your sense in the direction of European engagement with Iran? What is the roadmap? What are some of the priorities that your government in particular wants to discuss with the Iranian counterparts going forward beyond the deal?
Thank you, Ellie. Well, first of all, for the European direction, I think Helga Schmidt, the Secretary General, said it very clearly. As far as my own government is concerned and the Dutch activities in Iran, we see the same growth as in the other countries, not only in the economic area. Let me start with that, though. My first discussions at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs when I came to Iran 2 years ago, this was before implementation day, and they stressed Shell has to come back, KLM has to come back, we need legal cooperation. And if I look in the room, Shell is here, KLM is here, they're working in Iran. So I say that to the Iranian decision makers, see what we have reached already, but there's so much more. In the economic field, we're concentrating on energy, gas and oil, water and agriculture. I think we're the first embassy with an agricultural expert. He arrived this summer. We have in our embassy a financial expert to help with the banking issue, which is particularly difficult in Dutch-Iranian relations because people look at Holland as a small country, but it is completely global. The Netherlands is the second exporter in the world of agricultural produce. So you can understand our banks are only working globally. And what we see, the banks that are coming back are medium and smaller banks, but not the big banks. So we are really working on that. There's a joint financial committee into that respect. I mentioned the financial expert, and also our credit export agency is open for Iran. Now, an important sector is the water sector. That is not only done through businesses, but it's also done through academic cooperation. And the University of Wageningen has a lot of contacts with universities, with government agencies in Iran, and are very active in that field. Legal cooperation. President Rouhani, he mentioned that we should really cooperate legally. The Hague is seen as the international legal capital of the world because of all the legal international institutions. And this month, a group of Iranian judges is visiting those institutions in the Netherlands. There's a political dialogue where we discuss a broad range of issues. There's a consular dialogue where a lot of issues are discussed. In the cultural field, Dutch artists are participating in cultural festivals in Iran, are winning prizes there. So whatever area you look, since the implementation day of the JCPOA, a lot has happened, and I foresee that as long as the JCPOA is in place, and like Nick said, when all countries are committed to that, this will continue. One word on the economic field, I'd like to stress what Danny was saying. The business climate in Iran is not always easy. It takes long for certain decisions to get the right approvals. All that takes a long time. So if there's a disillusionment, what we hear sometimes, that it goes slow, it's not only our businesses that are slow, but there is also a slowness on the other side, which we'd like to address and that we'd like to work on together.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Let me come to Ambassador Goilo, whose surname I have practiced a number of times. I hope I got that right, sir. You've been in Tehran, you were in Tehran for a very long time. You've seen a number of ups and downs in relations between Europe and Iran. Could you take us through briefly what areas of tangible progress you've seen, particularly in the last 4 years where we've had the more serious stage of the nuclear talks, the economic reopening? And do you also, as a follow-up question to that, see hopes for real progress in a second Rouhani term with the European Union?
Ellie, thank you very much. Indeed, I spent 7 years in Iran. Technically speaking, I'm back in Poland for, I was recalled 3 weeks ago. Indeed, I was probably the only ambassador here who presented his credentials to President Ahmadinejad, so and saying goodbye to President Rouhani. What were the changes? Of course, apart from the obvious change of the president, there is some sort of definitely economic progress in the Iranian economy. Just before the JCPOA, the Iranian economy was nosediving. The real growth was minus 7% in 2012, 2013. So this is one of the biggest changes, but still there are challenges. What is the major obstacle, in my opinion, for business with Iran is the lack of transparency of the Iranian economy. This is how the Europeans, at least, and I believe also the international community, how we can see that. I mean, there is lack of transparency, and this is a very broad notion, because lack of transparency is the also we don't know how exactly the infrastructure looks like, who is behind some decisions. We don't know what will be the decision for the future. So definitely there are some changes. From my perspective of someone who spent quite a long time, I can say that the Rouhani administration, this is a group of people who clearly understood had understood, and they understand that without some deep changes within the system, economy will not go further. The question is how to do that, and the question is about the, let's say, time perspective. Definitely what Iran has to do, in my opinion, is to make some structural changes in the economy, in the law. It must bring about more transparency, that we can see how we can make business, how we can invest. What shall be done on the side of the Europeans or the world community is, in my opinion, to help Iran. Helping Iran means that we should stick to the agreement. There is no other way, in my opinion. We should have a dialogue, and there is no dialogue if we don't have this agreement. We should promote clear and simple rules for trade relations, and this is both economy and politics somehow combined. Also for Iran, I think one of the good solutions for the future would be to tighten the relations with the European Union. In my opinion, one of the issues which is maybe not very obvious for everyone, but this is what the European Union has been trying for a long time, is the opening of the European delegation. This is strictly political. This is a political decision. This is a decision right now on the side of the Iranians, but I think it would be extremely helpful for both sides. So very briefly, this is how I see it.
Thank you very much. Let me just follow up on that one point with Ambassador Terstol, because your government has been involved with representing EU interests in Tehran. Can you explain for our audience what you are communicating to the government of Iran about why it's necessary to have this EU representation in Tehran? Because I sometimes find that there's miscommunication about the understandings around that.
Well, first of all, the European Union is more than just 28 member states. It has its own dynamics, it has its own policies, and especially if you look at trade and if you look at economics, a lot of those policies are made in Brussels and implemented in Brussels, and not so much anymore in the different member states, if you look at the external side of it. So trade treaties, bilateral trade treaties, we don't have bilateral trade treaties anymore. That's done through the EU. So the whole follow-up of all the business delegations from the European Union that have come to Iran, Helga Schmid mentioned the visit of Mogherini with 7 commissioners. The follow-up has to be done by the EU. Helga Schmid mentioned projects that are going on, like in a civil nuclear cooperation. There are projects between the European Commission and Iran in the water sector. It means money is flowing from Brussels to Iran. You have to do the follow-up, you have to do the programming, you have to do the reporting. A bilateral embassy that is representing the EU can never do that. We didn't have more people in our embassy when we were representing the EU. So to organize the visits, to make sure that appointments are made, fine, no problem. But all this follow-up, it's impossible to do from a bilateral embassy. Plus you need a consistency of the people from the Commission, from the Council, who work in the European representation to do that.
Thank you. Before I open it up to the audience, so I would encourage you to get your questions ready for us. Let me come back to you, Ambassador Hopton, because one of the items that's been much heatedly discussed in Washington is how to address contentious issues between the West and Iran vis-a-vis the region. And as Europeans, we've all, over the last couple of years, experienced that security in the Middle East is very much linked to security at home, and so that there is an added need to try and resolve those contentious issues. What are some of your government's thoughts and ideas about taking the engagement deeper beyond the nuclear issue to have frank, robust discussions on the regional issues at hand?
Well, I think first, let me just reiterate, Ellie, that the JCPOA is an agreement about very specific things, and the parties signed up to a deal which, as Secretary General Schmidt outlined, on one side offers the lift of some sanctions, and the other side it involves the commitment of Iran to certain elements, certain behaviors related to its nuclear program. And that is obviously a great achievement. It took 13 years of diplomacy to achieve, and that is why the United Kingdom is fully committed to it and is working with all our partners for it to become a success, and that will take time and continued efforts on all parts. I think in that context, the United Kingdom sees the JCPOA as being the best option to address wider issues. And there are, of course, issues where the United Kingdom and our partners do not see eye to eye with Iran and the way that Iran behaves in certain parts of the region. But I think that is a separate set of issues, and the JCPOA is useful only in that respect as it will make it more likely that over time we will be able to address those issues with greater success than we have until now.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Let me open up the discussions. If the microphones can be ready, I'm going to go to Ali and the gentleman in the back, Adnan, and the lady at the front, please. Are you okay collecting questions?
Yeah.
The gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ambassadors, for sharing your insights. I want to follow up.
Can you please also introduce yourself as well?
Ali is from the International Crisis Group. I would like to follow up on a question that Ellie asked, and in response to that, we heard expressions of hope that Trump would not decertify or a wait-and-see attitude. And with all due respect, I think the community here needs a little bit more reassurance than that. So I want to ask again, and if you could concretely give us ideas of what the Europeans would do under the conditions that Iran remains fully committed to the agreement, but the Trump administration starts taking steps through decertification or reimposition of some of the sanctions that would undermine the JCPOA. Would you consider reviving the blocking regulations that the European Union had in place in the late 1990s and effectively deterred extraterritorial US sanctions? Thank you.
Thanks. Ali, if you can just pass it to the lady at the front because you're very close.
Thank you. Good morning, Your Excellencies. Well, what you discussed mostly was regarding financing. But I would like to ask you what obstacle you see in Iran in order to attract direct foreign investment, and what we should do over there in order to overcome these problems. Thank you.
Thank you. And a final question in the back.
Good morning, Adnan Tabatabai from Carpo, based in Germany. Thanks for this excellent panel. Actually, Ali Vaez already took away my question, and I would rephrase it in, would you see a scenario for the elephant in the room was mentioned, what if the elephant left the room? So is there any prospect for a P4+1 or EU E3+2 safeguarding this agreement? And my second question would be, there is a hell lot of complaints of Iranians about the issues to get a visa to Europe. What have your embassies or what are your embassy's ideas to facilitate that, and is there any prospect? Because that would lead, obviously, to more European-Iranian interaction. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me first come on the issue of direct foreign investment. Danny, maybe I'll pose that question to you.
Yeah, as mentioned by several of us in the panel, it's not only an issue of the nuclear agreement, it's not only an issue of financing or banking relations, it's also about the necessity of some structural reforms in Iran. If you look at the World Bank Index, Ease of Doing Business, and it's actually based on, I think, 8 different parameters, and there you can go in specifically and see what needs to be done in Iran to ease the life of foreign companies to do business in Iran. I don't remember the details, but one aspect that I do personally find very attractive about the Danish market is the flexicurity model, that it's easy to hire and easy to fire. I know also a lot of Iranian companies, but also a lot of European companies are hesitant to hire too many people because it can be difficult to get rid of them if business slows down. So there are some needs for different kinds of reforms in Iran.
Anyone has responses on the direct foreign investment question?
If I may just very briefly on this, say that, well, first of all, most of you are better placed than we are, I mean, to know what the obstacles are, of course, and we hear what you are saying on this. Corruption is one of these factors. Sometimes as an ambassador, you do not realize it because you are not exposed to it. But companies come to you and say, look, I have this problem because I've been doing this deal, and then suddenly I am under pressure from blah, blah, blah. So there are obstacles. But I would like to draw your attention to the speech that President Rouhani gave to the UN General Assembly. And the last part of his speech was about the need to proceed with internal reforms, which is a bit unusual when you have these speeches, you know, talking about big international issues. But it shows that the government of Iran is very well aware of the obstacles and the need to solve them. He headed over the intellectual property laws, for instance, this kind of things. So we are hopeful that we can proceed on this because there is awareness, obviously, in the government.
Thank you very much. Nick, let me come to you on the question of reassurances and a potential P4+1 consideration. And let me add to that, in 2014, with my work with the European Council on Foreign Relations, we did a lot of consultations around Europe about what we would do if we had unreasonable obstruction from the US Congress to a deal that was supported by the US executive. We're now potentially in the inverse situation where we have an uncooperative executive in the White House, but perhaps some helpful players in Congress who are supportive of the deal and maintaining transatlantic unity on this issue. And now some of the thinking that we're doing is about, you know, the number one priority should still be to keep the unity and try and demonstrate to the Trump administration the benefits of the deal and the costs that would be imposed from walking away. At the same time, there is, of course, an urgent need to consider contingency plans of the type that we were considering in 2014, including reviving and dusting off the books of these blocking regulations. If you could expand on that in this type of a forum for what would be helpful for these companies to hear, please do.
Well, I think I would push back slightly on the assertion that more reassurance is needed from what you've already heard this morning. As the Secretary General Helga Schmidt made clear, there is 28 European states agreed on the importance of the JCPOA and our continued commitment to making it work. I think you've heard the same thing from each of the countries represented here in different ways. And just to reiterate, the British position is that this is a very important deal. Our commitment is not in question. We see this as a very important diplomatic achievement. It provides a strong reassurance to the world on Iran's nuclear program, and it rules out for over a decade that Iran could work on acquiring a nuclear weapon. In fact, the deal goes, and this touches on the point you were making, Ellie, perhaps about looking beyond the JCPOA. Well, I would argue that it's This isn't the time to be doing that. This is the time to be making the JCPOA work, because the JCPOA itself goes well into the future. It is an extraordinary achievement if you think about the commitment Iran has entered into in reducing and maintaining below 300 kilograms its uranium stocks, in not starting to exceed the construction of centrifuges. And both of those commitments go well beyond 10 years. And then, of course, an unprecedented agreement that the IAEA should continue monitoring compliance for 25 years, so well beyond just a decade. But the JCPOA is therefore a very important deal that is worth maintaining, and all parties should be encouraged to do that. Picking up slightly on your point, Ellie, that I think if the President of the United States decides to not recertify for whatever reason, my understanding is that the question would then be put to Congress, as you say. And from the United Kingdom's perspective, we would continue to discuss with our American allies how important the deal is, and we would be talking to Congress, obviously, more at that stage about the benefits of the deal, how it constrains Iran's nuclear program, how, in our view, it makes it easier and more likely to achieve success in addressing some of the wider issues, not addressed by the JCPOA, but some of the wider issues which cause us concern. So lots of benefits to all the partners involved in the JCPOA, and that is where the United Kingdom will continue to strive very hard to make it a success.
Thank you very much, Nick. We have time for a couple of more questions. I'm going to give the faces that we haven't heard from during this conference. There are two hands up in that side. The lady just behind you has caught my attention. There we go.
Hello. My name is Mahkol. I work at a Swedish law firm. I have a question for Nicholas Houghton. Until Britain formally withdraws from the EU, it's still bound by its obligations as a member state, including the JCPOA, giving effect to the sanctions lifting to Iran. You say that the UK government is committed to its obligations under the JCPOA, but what are the indications once Brexit takes effect that Britain will not impose new sanctions on Iran, or perhaps enter into bilateral agreement with Iran?
Thank you very much. And I believe there's a gentleman right in front of that lady right there. Thank you.
Yes, Livia Manzini from Bell Holding. We've been talking a lot about the JCPOA, but we're all aware that there are other issues, and sometimes, they don't wait. So a further complication has been the recent referendum of Kurdish Iraq about independence. Do you have the impression that this will be contained, or that it could flare up into another regional conflict that would then complicate relations between all the parties and affect, of course, trade as well? Thank you.
Thank you. And there is a gentleman at the back that we haven't heard from before. Just there. I'm pointing at him with, there you go.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Nick. I work for Swiss Aviation. Thank you, ambassadors. I would like to just re-endorse my colleague's question about facilitation of visa. In my case, 12 years ago, it was purely the visa that I chose Switzerland over Canada. And we see some empty seats today, and this is a big step necessary for any business to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me take the questions in reverse order. Ambassador Goylo, since you've seen the ups and downs of visa processes as well, maybe you could comment on the problems of getting visas for Europe, for Iranians trying to come here to interact with businesses in Europe and expand those relations.
Thank you. It's a good question, because this is a question that I have every now and then when I meet with the Iranian business community. In general, the policy of the European Union or the Schengen states is very clear. If you have proper documents and if you register in proper time, you will get the visa. So there is no specific restriction on visas. There is nothing like we have some sort of discriminatory policy against the Iranian business. Not at all. Mostly the problem is with due time of applying for visa and with some documents. But these are strictly, in my opinion, technical issues.
Apparently, a lot of the ambassadors want to comment on this visa issue, so Ambassador Trestle, please.
When I came in 2015, we had 12,000 visa requests. In 2016, this was 18,000, and now we're heading for 24,000. With the same amount of people, we're still handling this enormous increase in visa requests. And the waiting time has not increased. So we're looking, first of all, at efficiency. As some of you may know, that our embassies are now looking at outsourcing. The Netherlands embassy is working with VFS, and we started in August this year. Well, the beginning, you always have a little bit startup problems, but it's running smoother and smoother. So I'm confident we can handle even more than 24,000 in the future. At the same time, the concerns for businessmen are very legitimate. You want to travel quickly. If there is a fair, maybe you know 2 months before, but if there's a special training or if you want to close a business deal, you have to travel much faster than the 2 months, 2.5 months waiting time that there is now. So we have, for legitimate business people in context of Dutch companies, there's a special orange policy, orange carpet policy, and if you qualify under that policy, you get an appointment really fast. So we look at all kinds of measures to get the businessmen to the Netherlands.
Thank you. Just because we're out of time, I'm going to park the visa responses for now, but come to Ambassador Anand and Ellie to comment on this issue of, the normalization with Iran isn't happening in a vacuum. There's lots of events happening all around Iran, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Turkey. What is your impression about the road ahead? Can European engagement with Iran proceed? And can we manage these instabilities around Iran?
Yes, I believe so, and I definitely hope so, because I think we have enough conflicts in the Middle East, and another conflict would not be to anybody's benefit. And with regard to the Kurdish issue or the North Iraq issue, I don't believe that it will develop more into a direct conflict. Basically, everybody has been out against the referendum, the US, the EU, obviously the neighboring countries, and basically, to my knowledge, there's only one country that has come out in support of the Kurdish referendum, and that is Israel. So I don't believe that it will develop into more. But I think it's also very important that we address the regional issues in a wider conflict, in a wider perspective, and we do not forget that Iran is not operating in a vacuum. Basically that's it.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Ellie?
Well, on this, I think we have to see this problem also in a longer-term perspective. Iran still very much suffers from the consequences of the revolution, because it's now more than 30 years. But you have to see that it's a traumatic event, not only in the country, but in the region. We had the French Revolution, we had the Russian Revolution, there was the Iranian Revolution. In each of these cases, it took decennia for all the countries, to get used to the new reality, to adapt to it. And so very often what you see in the first decennia after such an event is a policy of containment, where basically all countries around are just saying, okay, let's try to control the situation, and then over time we will see how it evolves. The same happened with Iran. We went to a policy of containment because a number of countries were worried about developments, but now we would like to move to another phase. Time has come, and rightly so. And so Iran now really has to be recognized as a legitimate great power in this region. But it is not the only one with this kind of ambition in the region. So we have to engage Iran now, I think, not with a perspective of containment, but with a perspective of an important partner with very legitimate goals and which can be useful for us also. We can certainly work together. And all these conflicts, I mean, Kurdistan, I mean, Syria, in the Gulf, we have to try to find a way of starting a discussion which is no longer based on these old premises, you know, of containment, but of partnership. And this is what most of us, I think, are trying to do. And this is a big challenge for the coming years.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Hopton, I was finding it quite refreshing not to have mentioned Brexit so far in the conference, but there we go, you have a specific question. But if you could have a brief answer regarding whether UK policy will change.
I think this is one area where Brexit doesn't have big implications. I think that the United Kingdom is a party to the JCPOA in a sovereign right, in our national right. Obviously working very closely and with our European partners as well. But I don't think the United Kingdom's policy to Iran will be determined by Brexit.
Thank you. Maybe I will just offer a very brief wrap-up before we go to the view from Washington, and that is, I have seen, as we've seen on the panel, but also in my discussions over the last 8 months, a real dedication and coordination to a level I've not seen amongst EU member states in terms of safeguarding the nuclear deal. And I think that's a very important message for Iranian colleagues in the room to take back. And at the same time, I think in Tehran, we need to also appreciate that the transatlantic relationship is incredibly important to almost all members of the European Union, and that there is a number of priorities besides from Iran, which is saving the Iran nuclear deal is definitely in the top priorities, but there are a number of issues where the discussions are being had with counterparts in the White House. But I think that the people on the panel and many others in the room are trying to work very hard to put Iran consecutively on the agenda and keep the deal in place and expand on this engagement that we've seen happening across the years. So a very warm thanks to you all again, and I'd like to welcome our colleagues for the next panel on the stage. Thank you very much.